It's November in St. Louis, following the grand jury decision not to indict Officer Darren Wilson for any wrongdoing in the shooting of Michael Brown. We've got more protesting, rioting, looting, arson. This tragedy doesn't want to end. And the painful rift between us, is not healing. Just as we saw in August, the National Press Corps presents us with shallow, self-serving, non-professional, despicably slanted views of the events. You can call it anything you want, but it's not objective journalism. Their simplistic, sensational description of the events even fails to clearly differentiate the various groups coming into play. And it totally ignores a huge segment of the population. Now, the group that gets the most attention, of course, is the peaceful protesters. We see images of a few hundred of them at a time on television. Maybe there's 1,000 of them, maybe there's several thousand of them. There's really no way of knowing. I've never seen any numbers attached to them. But they're all portrayed as powerless victims of the racist police presence. Now, I'm going to share a few of my feelings about their plight later, but first, let's list the other players. As aforementioned, we have, of course, the racist police. They're ignorant, unfair, they're just cruising the streets looking for any possible way to persecute blacks. They were, of course, the main cause of the looting in August as they displayed a military-like presence. Now, this time around, they're again at fault for the looting and the tragic November fires because they showed an impotent presence to appease our government and to appease our press. Now, there's a third group here. That would be the looters, the arsonists, the gangsters that are taking shots at the fire trucks as they respond to the fires. Let's call them what they are. Let's call them barbarians. And we've seen images of all these non-peaceful events on television too. And I got to tell you, the efforts from the press to first lump together and then differentiate between these barbarians and the peaceful protesters, it's comical. Not really. There's nothing funny about any of this. That's a bad word. But once again, it's hard to find out how many of these barbarians there are. I've seen numbers from a few hundred to over 1,000. But since they disappear into the cracks when the sun comes out like cockroaches, we'll probably never be able to put an accurate count on them. Group number 4. This is a smaller group, a much, much more sinister set of characters. This is a group of sociopaths that are doing their absolute best to incite a race war. These are people who attempted to put together a plot to assassinate Bob McCullough, the prosecuting attorney, Tom Jackson, the police chief of Ferguson, to set off explosives at the St. Louis Arch on the observation deck. Now, does that sound like peaceful protest, or does that sound like terrorism? Well, it can't be terrorism because the press didn't use that word. But if you were to see scenes like this on TV that we saw in Ferguson earlier this week, with buildings burning and rioting in the streets, if you had seen scenes like that in Baghdad or Jerusalem or London or Paris, is there any doubt in your mind that they would be called acts of terror? I think not. Now, there's probably just a handful of these terrorists that are inciting these events. Maybe a dozen or two, maybe 50 or more. I'm not really certain, but there is one thing that I guarantee, and listen to me carefully. There are more of these psychopath terrorists in St. Louis right now than there are racist cops in the entire St. Louis regions. Guaranteed. Okay, so let's add things up. By my count, if you call it 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 peaceful protesters, hey, if you think it's more, use your number. 500 to 1,000 barbarians, if you think that's high, you use your number. Maybe 50 terrorists. So what we're talking about here is something like 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people. And again, if you think my numbers are wrong, use your own numbers. But let's compare your numbers or my numbers with the population of Greater St. Louis. 2,700,000. Let's compare your numbers or my numbers with the population of the suburban community of Ferguson. A little over 22,000. Now, by the way, if you're not from St. Louis, Do not fall into the trap to think that Ferguson was an inner city slum. Ferguson was a quiet, clean, and fairly typical St. Louis suburb community. Not now. It's going to take years for Ferguson to recover from this, and I know they will, because there's lots of nice people in Ferguson, there's lots of nice people in the St. Louis region, and this brings up a group of people that the national press has all but ignored. What about the other 17 or 18,000 residents of Ferguson? What about them? Now, I've seen a few short filler pieces on a couple of local news stations. One was an interview with a man that lived behind one of the burned out businesses. It was a pretty scary night for him. And on a personal level, a couple of days just before the violence, I was in a large retailer. There were not very many people in the store. And when I went to the checkout lane, the clerk seemed somewhat detached. And as politely as I could, I asked her if she was all right. She said she was okay, but I was still bold enough to pursue it, and she opened up to me. It seems that she lives right there in the heart of Ferguson. She was lamenting on what was going to happen when the Wilson decision was announced. She didn't know if she really wanted to stay in her house, and if she did, she didn't know where she could park her car safely. This is the untold story of Ferguson. This is the awful dread that those other 17,000 Ferguson residents have to face. Their food markets are gone. Their pizza restaurant burned down. Their local mechanic is out of business. Their quiet suburb community has been sacked. And the clowns from the national press have delighted at the mayhem while focusing on only the most vocal and theatrical players in the dreadful event. The press has ignored the tens of thousands of Ferguson residents and those in other affected nearby communities who go to work every day, who contribute to their community, who are saddened by the death of Michael Brown, but who realize that Michael's actions set into motion this string of tragic events. People who teach their children to be respectful of the police and, if stopped, answer questions with yes, sir, or no, sir. Now, like all of us, I am saddened by the death of Michael Brown. But I'm confused that hands up, don't shoot remains the anthem of the protesters, when it has been proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that this version of the event was a complete fabrication. It didn't happen that way. Now, I'm truly and deeply concerned that there's such a lack of conversation. We're not listening to one another. We're simply shouting at each other. And there's our press again, fanning the flames, throwing more gasoline on the fire. Oh, if only they could be lucky enough to be on the scene when there's another shooting. Oh, it could be a Pulitzer Prize, you know. These jackals feed on our tragedy. They thrive on our division. It seems obvious that the national press has evolved into an entertainment industry, not the same essential fourth estate that dedicated to serve and protect freedom and justice that it once was. The presence of that ethical version of the fourth estate was very instrumental in the formation of our society in past years. It's gone. I live here in St. Louis region. I am close to the issues and to the affected communities. It seems to me that the one and only daily newspaper in the area and the invading hordes from the National Press Corps have once again simply sought out the sensational to sell their frigging newspapers and to increase their precious ratings. Ferguson burned to the delight of the cameraman who got those good shots. Thanks for listening. Feel free to share.